as well. Because we're live streaming this event, we'll be trying to stay in the location of the podium, so I feel a bit blocked in, but at least you can hear me, right? Thank you for being here tonight. I am Crystal Hall. I'm Associate Professor of Digital Humanities here at Bowdoin. I'm also co-director of the Digital and Computational Studies Initiative. We are delighted to see all of you. We're very happy to have our speaker here this evening to kick off the semester of events related to DCS. And before I introduce Professor Knowles, I did want to say a few things about upcoming events that might be of interest to you. The first is next week on Tuesday night. We're hosting a workshop here in the VAC on research with Twitter data. So this workshop starts at 6 o'clock. We have pizza, soda, and we will be providing the Twitter data. We'll also be teaching you how to gather that data on your own, some of the analyses that you might want to run with that kind of data, and then some basic visualizations that you can do with that information as well. It's open to faculty, to students. You can bring your own data. Like I said, you can use some of ours. We've been gathering data from Twitter on the hashtag Black Lives Matter, also on the hashtag climate change, and also POTUS, so the President of the United States, which has been a rather active Twitter handle over the last few weeks. We'll be hosting a follow-up workshop in early November, and we're still entertaining ideas for the theme of that workshop. So if you have ideas, if there are burning research questions that you have related to data or to digital and computational studies, let us know. And without further ado, because we have a great talk coming up, I would like to introduce our guest this evening. Professor Ann K. Knowles is Professor of History at the University of Maine and a 2015 Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellow. We've been really lucky to have her here as part of events today, meeting with the class, going to lunch with students, and she'll be talking to us tonight about her current project. Professor Knowles earned a BA in English at Duke University, and after a life-changing encounter with maps that she was telling us about today at lunch, she pursued her advanced degrees in geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her work in Historical Geographic Information Systems, abbreviated as HGIS, is ambitious, creative, collaborative, and I think it really is a model for practitioners in the field. She is author and editor of several books and other major publications. I'll just highlight two, but I would invite you to explore her other work in more detail. The first that I want to highlight is the 2008 work on What Could Lee See at Gettysburg? That was the inspiration for our first case study in the new Introduction to Digital and Computational Studies course that we're teaching this spring. The second piece that I want to highlight is her 2013 volume with the University of Chicago Press titled Mastering Iron, The Struggle to Modernize an American Industry, 1800 to 1868, which won the Association for American Geographers John Brinkerhoff Jackson Prize. And my final remark in this very brief set of comments is that Professor Knowles has been, and I think really this work will show, continues to be a collaborator in some very notable digital humanities projects, including the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative, about which she will be speaking. And I will add, this is not our copy of this book, but our copy of the accompanying Geographies of the Holocaust volume is on display over in Hawthorne-Longfellow Library as part of an ongoing exhibit there. So I would invite you to think about how this work is represented in print as well as digitally and computationally. So please join me in welcoming Professor Knowles.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming. At least it's dry in here, right? It's been an adventuresome day. I'm full of admiration for what Crystal and her colleague Mohammed have put together for a course this semester. Digital humanities is risky work. Risky for the teachers, risky for scholars, risky for students, and that's why I love it. I have had my most exciting moments as a person, I think, when something emerged in my awareness that was so exciting that I had to give it a try. Dance was like that. I went to New York to be a dancer. I was talking to Garrett about this. Discovering that you could study history by mapping it completely changed my life, and I went from being a book editor to being a historical geographer, took my first geography course at 30. And the work of the Holocaust Geographies project has been ongoing exposure, voluntary exposure to massive risks with massive rewards. Let me tell you how am I close enough to the microphone? I'll go here. Is this good?
That's better.
All right. I'll tell you, for the record, how I got involved in this project. I was working at Middlebury College, where I taught from 2002 to last May in the geography department there. I was sitting at my desk. It was, I think, a November day in 2005 when I got a telephone call out of the blue from a man named Michael Haley Goldman, who explained that he was calling from the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., that he was in the Registry of Survivors, which is a core research unit at the Holocaust Museum, and that they had heard recently of something called GIS that they thought might help them manage an enormous load of data that they were about to begin to receive from the International Tracing Service, which was set up immediately after the war, actually while the war was still going on, World War II, to try to collect information to reconnect Holocaust victims, refugees, displaced persons with their relatives, or help them find out what happened to them in the tremendous chaos that the war created. The ITS had 8 million documents that they were going to be sending to the Holocaust Museum, digital copies mostly, all of which had geographic information attached, which turns out to be 95% roughly of all information generated ever by humans on Earth. What is geographic information? It's some sort of locational clue. In the case of the Holocaust, think of the infamous train transport records, which have a place where the train begins and a place where the train ends, geographic information. Think of copies of people's passports, where they're born, where they've traveled, where the passport perhaps was confiscated, and so on. Any information that you can locate counts as geographic information. So the folks at the Holocaust Museum saw both a huge problem, how do we deal with this data, how do we help scholars make sense of it, and an opportunity. We've heard that GIS, a computer-based mapping and analysis approach, there are many kinds of GIS, could help us manage the data and get scholars working in the Holocaust doing new kinds of investigations, geographical studies of the Holocaust, which has hardly been done. There are a few exceptions, but it was basically brand new. This sent thrills down my spine as an extraordinary opportunity. I was, at that time, finishing the first draft of my book on the iron industry. I was a 19th century American industrial and immigration scholar. But this seemed much too good to let pass. And so I helped organize a small workshop with 9 participants at the Holocaust Museum. It took place in August 2007. We were all fascinated with the possibilities for studying the Holocaust geographically, and we were all willing to take that risk of doing something way outside our comfort zone. For the Holocaust historians, it meant thinking spatially for the first time. For the geographers, it meant studying a very well-documented, incredibly complex historical phenomenon for the first time. And what we have discovered over the 8 years now that our group has been working together is that by playing to our strengths, listening to each other, the very heartbeat of collaboration, I think, is really listening to each other and appreciating what everyone brings to the work, that we've been able to do some new things and make some breakthroughs. And that's what I would like to show you today. It's the work of this project, both the scholars and the students. I'm now at the University of Maine. It's an R1. I'm in a history department. Everything for me is new. But I've been working with students at Middlebury College for 13 years and have discovered that undergrads are fabulous research assistants. So much of the work I'm going to show you is from that, and I hope to find new ways to do that at Maine with graduate and undergraduate students. First, I must introduce my collaborators. Paul Jascott, art historian at DePaul, who is a specialist on the built environment of Auschwitz. Eric Steiner, a brilliant cartographer and designer, creative director at the Stanford Spatial History Lab, whose website I highly recommend to you, some of the best digital projects being done in America and around the world. Simone Gigliotti, a feminist scholar who has specialized in much of her career on the bodily experience of victims. She wrote an incredible book on what it was like to be inside the train cars. It's called The Train Journey. Alberto Giordano, our, you'd love Alberto. I'm looking at our Italianist here. An Italian GI scientist at Texas State University. Simone, by the way, is in New Zealand. Waitman Bourne, behind my left shoulder, a former lieutenant in the Army in Iraq, a topographic engineer, a mapping specialist who became a specialist as a scholar on the Wehrmacht in the East, what's called the Holocaust by bullets. Mark Mazerovsky in the black shirt, the man at the Holocaust Museum who first thought we need GIS, who is a specialist on Jewish stolen art. Tim Cole, behind him, the great expert in the world, really, on the Budapest ghetto, the Jewish ghetto in Budapest. In front of him in the yellow, Anna Hollian, a scholar of deportees at Arizona. Tim is at Bristol. Waitman was at Nebraska, just relocated to the Holocaust Museum in Richmond. And in the blue shirt on the far right is Robert Ehrenreich, who was the enlightened man who thought we should bring together historians and geographers and see what happens. This is the group whose chemistry has sustained me and inspired me since 2007. And then there are the students. And here, I'm not going to introduce all of them, but this is my first undergraduate seminar to go to the Holocaust Museum in 2008. You can see how excited we all were. The Holocaust Museum invited us down to give presentations, for the students to give presentations on their research on the geography of the Holocaust. And there are a couple people I do want to introduce because you're going to see their work. In the blue shirt, near the far left, Chester Harvey, who made a number of the maps you're going to see, and a particular project I'll introduce. Next to him in the white, Jack Cuneo, whose animation of the camps I'm going to show you. The very tall fellow in the back with the glasses, a French major named Robbie Burton, who thought, before I graduate, I should take a geography course. He ended up working with the sort of guy you can't see, you can just see his eyes like this, Alex Yule, to animate the Einsatzgruppen. I have one of their visuals. This was a wonderful group, and boy, did going to the Holocaust Museum raise everybody's game because they were presenting to scholars and got critical feedback. It was an extraordinary experience. The examples that I'd like to show you now from the students' work and the scholars will give you a taste of a number of different ways that we've approached studying the geography of the Holocaust. Much of it is mapping, but not entirely. I do want to begin with an example of our mapping because it probably is the most distinctive thing in our approach, the most explicitly geographical. And it also connects with what we were talking about in the class today. There are a number of members of the class here now. And that is, when you build a database from historical information, you have to structure it in a certain way to be able to get the outputs that you want, in our case, maps. That sometimes does some violence to the data, but it also can be incredibly useful. Jack Cuneo, the guy in the white shirt, was the first person in our group to try to animate the development of the SS concentration camps. These include many of the big famous camps that everyone's heard of, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, and many others, as well as the labor camps that were associated with those big camps. And what he was trying to do was figure out the patterns of the development and then the demise of that system. This, by the way, the maps I'm going to show you, include about 1,300 camps, 23 main camps, and then more than 1,000 small sub-camps, labor camps. The Holocaust Museum now predicts that by the time they are done developing all of the research in their definitive encyclopedia of camps and ghettos, that there will be probably 60,000 places of incarceration, punishment, and death under the Nazis. That figure is dumbfounding. It is transformative. It will be transformative within Holocaust studies, and it demands GIS, because GIS is a computer system that can manage very large amounts of located data. So what I'm showing you now is the beginning of a project that's likely, I hope, if I can keep getting money for it, to continue for at least 20 years. Here is Jack's little database. It's in Excel. I don't like Excel, but Jack was very good at it. One thing I've learned working with students is to let them do what they can do, and I sort of can critique it. One of the basic things he had to do was translate natural language into the language that a GIS computer system could read. GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems. It's a kind of software, a class of software that allows you to map anything with location attached. So it also can map change over time. You see all those, I hope some of you can see a dates column with words and numbers with quotation marks around them. That's how the historians who created this database entered the information. This is related to their Encyclopedia Volume 1. So April 21, 1944, that's how you write a date, right? Well, that's not how GIS reads a date. So from this beginning database, he had to create a column for the month, which was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 through 12, then the day, then the year. These little steps are part of database construction that's tedious but necessary to get results. I'm now going to, oh, it's already started. The map that's running is Jack's animation, and I think I can replay it too. Red means something new has happened, a new big camp at a square, a small camp with a circle, and then it persists on the map as changes continue to happen. I'm going to replay this so that I can read the dates to you as it goes. Let me just back up for a moment, go back to the beginning, and I'll just read the dates. It's 6-month increments. July 1, 1936 is where we start. January 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45. That explosion of red at the beginning of 1945 is a reflection of the desperation of the Germans reaching into the camp system for labor to try to keep the war effort going. They're using prisoners for everything by that time. Making food, fixing tires, manufacturing rockets, because any able-bodied German man is fighting if he hasn't already been killed or captured and so forth. It's a very simple animation. All you're seeing is location and time at 6-month increments, very crude, and yet it is suggestive, isn't it? It raises questions. What caused that? Why is it stretching out this way and then it's going over to the Baltics? This is one of the powerful things about visualizing information geographically. It almost unfailingly raises new questions that scholars hadn't thought of. And I think it's also very useful pedagogically. So Jack's little database, which took a great deal of effort in one semester, was the beginning of our thinking about how do we show place and time. Change is so important in history. Can we do that with mapping? Here's a close-up of Jack in the brown sweater, and this is looking at a project I'm going to show you more about later that Chester created. Part of our technique was, our research technique, was to have constant meetings, constantly asking one another, how's it going? What's the database look like? Let's run a test. There's an iterative process with digital work that makes for a sort of ongoing discussion that I find very, very stimulating. Here is a more updated and one could say more scholarly development of that SS concentration camp study. This is what we published in the book. It's still not definitive, it's still a work in progress, but we were able to reach a point of summary for what we did in the first 7 years or so. The image here is created by Eric Steiner. Eric is really a visual genius, I think. He took the database that began as Jack's database. We then augmented it with additional data, additional information. But Eric's vision for this system was not a typical map. It was, what is this system doing to Europe, to the world? So this is the opening image that he created for the chapter in the book. I worked on this with Paul Jascott, the art historian, and Benjamin Perry Blackshear's student, some of whose work we'll now see. A summary map, a very conventional map of the SS system. Here, color connects main camps to subcamps. And this is a sort of basic, I think of it as a kind of diagnostic test. What are some of the basic patterns here? One of the first things that often strikes people when they see this map is just that there are so many dots. And then you think of 60,000 instead of 1,300, and the complexity is kind of staggering. Here is a GIS kind of visualization called sightline analysis. It's related to what the students were doing with Gettysburg, but it really is, here it's purely visual. It's a Euclidean straight line distance between one point and its central node. Here the central nodes are the main camps, so Neuengamme, Ravensbrück, and so forth are the main camps, and then the little star-like sprays are just showing kind of the shape of the system between the main camp and its related labor camps and so forth. This generated some questions for us. You see that tan line that reaches all the way into the Ukraine? It goes to Kiev. That's 800 miles as the crow flies. I have not yet had time to answer the questions this generates for me. Was there a social connection between someone running a factory in Kiev who knew the commandant at Sachsenhausen and was able to get 20 laborers to come all the way to Kiev to help him manufacture stuff? What explains that extraordinary relationship? Perhaps more important to the German war effort, why are workers being sent from Ravensbrück, that's where a women's camp, all the way down to Flossenburg and Mauthausen territory? I'm not walking away because of the microphone, but I hope you can see those gray lines that go way down into southern Germany. So there are some unexpected spatialities here. The logic that you might expect of, oh, of course labor would be closest, is violated over and over here. Many possible research topics could be generated by this one map. We were concerned about the historical accuracy of our mapping. So a student at Stanford, a history student, developed historically accurate boundaries for us. There were no digital boundaries existing during, for the World War II period, when territorial boundaries were changing all the time during the war. So he developed those for us, and then we're able to map change in relationship to that. So as the Reich expands, that's the outline in orange, where our camps, turns out all the main camps under the SS administration, were within the territory of the Reich. They were not going beyond that geopolitical boundary, which is kind of interesting, not that surprising. I think in the interest of time, I may skip over this, but I can come back. This is another visualization of the data. Let me just make the general point that once you build a database, you can visualize it in almost countless ways. Even if you build a database intending to map, you can also use something like Tableau, which is what this software was, to ask other questions. I guess I better tell you what this is. This punch card graphic is what we call it, shows the opening of camps in a different array. Here the main camps are the little black jots, and the sub-camps are in red. So what this shows that the map does not is very different timing in the development of labor systems. So you can foreground time, or you can foreground space. You often have to make that kind of choice. And that explosion of red that we saw on the animated map appears in the heavy concentration of red at the end of the graphic on the right. We can ask other questions. How many of the camps were involved in manufacturing arms? That's what's in red here. And you can phrase endless questions. And this is a related map. Where were workers from labor camps primarily involved in making armaments? That's in orange. Or doing construction work? That's in black. This has consequences for survival because construction labor is so physically grueling. There were higher rates of mortality and so forth. So that project is ongoing, and we're now building a database of ghettos. And we would like, before too many years go by, to map the development of camps in relationship to the development of ghettos, and then the liquidation of ghettos into the camps. The next example I'd like to show was highlighted on the poster for this talk, which is our Auschwitz project. Here, Paul Jascott was the lead as the expert on the built environment of Auschwitz. This is Eric's opening image, using part of a database whose construction I'm going to explain a bit to you now. Chester Harvey, who was that chipper blonde in the blue shirt in the opening student image, did most of the graphics and analytical development here. Ben Blackshear also made some images. This project began as a question of visibility, actually growing out of the Gettysburg Project. What parts of Auschwitz were most easy to control by lines of sight? We thought we might do a study of building the camp three-dimensionally and then asking what could you see from the guard towers, assuming those would be the most dangerous places for prisoners or the most tightly surveilled and controlled. That's where we began, and that's why we opened with this photograph. This is one of the Auschwitz album photos, a photograph taken by an SS photographer of the arrival of Jews from Hungary in 1944 at Auschwitz, the dividing of the men and the women and so forth. But for us, what this image sparked was thinking about, might we be able to use photographic evidence to determine visibility? That was the beginning of our project, which led Paul to look at architectural plans. This historical photograph is of two Nazi architects working in Berlin at what's called the Zentralbauleitung, the central construction offices, where so many of the camps were planned. The Auschwitz plans are probably not those on the shelf, we're not sure, but they survive in greatest detail. So Paul was able to get copies of the architectural plans from the archive and begin marking them up for GIS translation. Translating from paper documents into digital is key to the preparatory work here. So we have actually a copy of a microfilm where Paul has outlined in yellow barbed wire fences, and in orange certain kinds of structures, which Chester, as the digital master, then began to translate into digital form. This is building Birkenau digitally. We got some GIS data from the Warsaw Public GIS Office. They were very happy to help us, send us some wonderful high-resolution data. Here, the project in progress, just a screenshot of the database taking shape. The outlines here are footprints of buildings. He also did some 3D work in CAD, which then made it possible to begin to do 3D visualizations of Birkenau. This is the great big part of the camp that was built quite rapidly in 42, 43, 44 to house tens of thousands of prisoners, and it was itself a labor camp. And here's another version of that where Chester was trying to estimate how much could a guard see using illumination algorithms within CAD, which is not very satisfactory, but it did get us thinking in a different way about visibility. What became most important in this study, however, was a surprise. And this is another kind of general note I'd like to make about digital work, whether it's with GIS or something else. You almost always find things you don't expect. This was the big, oh my, for us. Because that database of building footprints showed in rows in the data table, name of building, which architectural plans it's on, what its name was, when it was built, whether it was built, what it was used for. We could then ask the program, this is now in GIS, which buildings were planned but never built? Which buildings were built but they don't appear on a plan? And so forth. And that's what this map shows. This is a part of Auschwitz I. This is now the older part of the camp, not Birkenau. Green buildings were planned by architects in Berlin, and they were built pretty much as planned. The purple buildings, we know were built because of architectural documents, mostly managers' plans and so forth, rough sketches from the grounds, but they were not part of the ideal plan. And then the orange buildings were on the ideal plan, but they're never built. So what are those? That sort of curving arc with a long straight line over in the bottom right was supposed to be a garden estate for SS officers and mid-ranking bureaucrats, a garden city. Auschwitz was not only going to be a concentration camp, it was going to be a major capital for the expanded German Reich in the east. The Germans were going to rebuild it, so it needed some beautiful neighborhoods, wasn't built during the war, and formal reception areas. And that's what the sort of tuning fork missing the middle tine is in the upper right. That was going to be a grand pavilion where the commandant would receive visitors of state. What did they build instead in urgency? The purple buildings, kind of in the middle, lower middle, 4 rectangles, boom, 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 built in great haste, new barracks for guards, several hundred guards, to manage the anticipated influx of Hungarian Jews at the beginning of 1944. Now, what this triggered in Paul's mind and mine was that we could use GIS to compare Nazi plans, ideology, and rhetoric to what actually happened on the ground, which is ultimately what mattered to people. So if you ask how was the Holocaust implemented, here is one piece of evidence. People made choices that they would set aside some grand plans, they would devote their resources to building quick, cheap wooden buildings to house enough guards to basically to do crowd control on 400,000 Hungarian Jews, most of whom were killed. This is the big map that's on the table where I said we're going to talk about this in a minute. Chester's project with a Chinese and geography major, Stephanie Ellis. Chester was a straight-on geography major. This begins to move me into the final set of ideas I'm going to talk about. How do you map experience? So far, what I've been showing you are built environments, sort of very broad-scale continental mapping. Mapping individuals' experiences is much more difficult, but also much more interesting for most of us. This very large map, which is shown here at about 150% of its original size, so it is a very big map, is their mapping of a diary by a survivor, a Holocaust survivor named Lucy Adelsberger. She was a doctor who was taken to Auschwitz and worked in one of the labor camps. She was on one of the evacuation marches as the Russians and the Allies are approaching. The Germans force lots of prisoners out of system after system to walk or to get on trains and try to escape the attacking armies. So her evacuation is one of those. Just to explain what you're seeing here, then I'll show you a detail. Chester and Stephanie mosaicked together wartime maps, topographic maps, that have very high locational fidelity, so a lot of very accurate locational detail. They have quotations above the line of the march from bystanders who made comments about seeing people go past. And below are extracts from Lucy Adelsberger's diary. Last thing is that the shading goes day and night, so the nighttime parts of the march are in shadow. And then color corresponds to Stephanie's assessment of Lucy Adelsberger's emotional condition. So, a close-up view. When they leave Auschwitz, it's marching out into the snows of January. It's very cold, but there's bright moonlight, the snow is pristine, and Lucy is euphoric to be walking out of Auschwitz. She doesn't know what lies ahead. She's frightened, but she's also out of the camp and moving and has a feeling of hopefulness. That's the green. Then during the night, it gets very cold, and they begin to encounter trouble, so stumbling and people panicking and so forth. It turns into yellow, and things deteriorate as the march goes on. You can imagine these are people not being fed. They're getting very little rest. They're terrified of what's coming, and so it becomes more and more fraught as it goes. But for Stephanie Ellis, that moment of green is significant. She said, one of the things that we have not begun to represent in the Holocaust Project is that people had mixed emotions during the Holocaust. It wasn't all terror and disaster. There were moments of meaningful communication, of support, of love, of happiness. And she was trying to show this. But when she and Chester gave this presentation at the Holocaust Museum, they came under respectful but serious criticism from the audience, who said, "How dare you reduce this terrifying experience to colors like out of a Crayola box? And how did you create your categories? How did you decide that she's happy here and unhappy there?" Which are very legitimate questions. Let me move on to another example. Here I'm also going to add another element. This is another student's work. I didn't have a picture of her to show you, that adds sound as well as sight to working with historical evidence. The student here was Maggie Smith, who became fascinated by a story of American prisoners of war, which Charles Guggenheim made a film of. It's called Berge. It's about one of the rare cases of American soldiers captured and put into a labor camp within the SS system at a place called Berge. And I just want to jump out to open up Maggie's work to show you. I'm sorry, this is just a little bit clumsy. I should have had it ready. I'm sorry. To show you what she put together. It's a multimedia presentation. My conferences, and there's Bowdoin, and here's Berge. Okay. And why does it look so, oh, there we go, okay. So the Berge project, we conceived of as a kiosk in a museum. It was experimental. It hasn't gone to any museum, but she wanted to try to tell the story spatially that the film had shown cinematically. So if you open the project, it begins with an oral quotation from the movie.
35 miles northeast of Frankfurt, a German army train prepared to leave the rail yards at the town of Bowdoin. Inside the cars were 350 American combat soldiers, prisoners of war, captured in the Battle of the Bulge. They got this funny-looking ride. Their eyes began to sort of sink into their head, it seemed like, you know, they really had a very strange look about them. I walked them. I couldn't carry them anymore. We tried to make notes as to where we were burying them. And then we came to a hill, a turn in the hill, in kneeling positions and fetal positions. And it was shot at close range. It was unbelievable. I had given up. I felt that was the end. That's when hope occurred. It got quiet. I survived. That was the important thing. It's a terrible thing, isn't it? But it's true. And all of a sudden, this guy stopped dying. When I saw that American flag coming down that road, nothing looked so beautiful in all our born days. Before the story of these men was known, Americans believed that such a thing could have happened, not to Americans, but only to people of a different kind, who came from a different place. But it did.
After that schematic introduction, then Maggie developed a series of story foci. I'm just going to show you two very quickly to show her continued exploration of the possibilities for mapping. One is her map of Berga and its surroundings, which shows the tunnels in red lines where the American prisoners of war were working on manufacturing rockets and digging the tunnels themselves. And in the death march, no, I'm sorry. There was one other thing on the previous one I wanted to show you. She was interested in working with text. There was one soldier who left a brief diary, Edward Gorenak. She took his diary and broke it into the days by theme of what he was talking about. When did he speak of weakness? When did he speak of home? Not much. When did he speak of violence? And so forth, work conditions. And in the latter part of the diary, when he is himself becoming very ill, sickness and death dominate the diary. And then in the last part, the men are sent on a death march. This is different than just an evacuation. This is marching men in order for them to die. And at the end, some of them were liberated, but they didn't all survive. And Maggie was interested in what difference did the route that they took make in their chances for survival? What happened in different terrain conditions? So she created a terrain model using online free data and mapped the mortality of the journey according to elevation and how far they were going on a given day. She also discovered in the course of doing this that once a particular guard named Metz, who was especially vicious, ran off, he deserted his post, the mortality stopped. Now maybe most of the weakest men by then had died, but his absence certainly must have helped save some. I find this project very compelling because it combined those voices at the beginning, even though that mapping is very abstract and one could do it in more effective ways, no question, but those voices are what is missing from the rest of this work. So as we go forward now, we are turning in the second phase of the project to working with Holocaust Testimony. Our new research partner is the USC, Southern California Shoah Foundation, which was established by the great filmmaker Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg in the 1990s, who wanted to preserve the memories of Holocaust victims by filming them. 3-hour interviews on average. We are trying to figure out how to extract the spatial stories from those testimonies while keeping people's voices and lived experience as part of what we present and what we analyze. A huge challenge, and I welcome any suggestions for how we might do it. We're just getting started with this new project. But what really inspired it was realizing that mapping alone is not enough. Mapping is telling us a lot of new things about the Holocaust, but without people, those abstract maps are really problematic. So, with that, I would like to invite any questions that you have. I also have a short YouTube video that I could show of our new work, but I think I've talked long enough and would be happy to field any comments you have. Yes,
So how do you, thank you so much. Wow, so fascinating.
you're welcome.
So a question that I have is, I can see how when you have the kind of data that was in the tracing services, documents, stamps, passports,
Mhm.
it's all very definite. But when you start dealing with things like diaries or letters or personal remembrances, people
Mhm.
forget, they switch dates, etc., how can your mapping take into account that sort of slippage of memory?
This is one of the huge questions. And how do you deal with traumatic memory as well? Dealing with any memory is dicey. And then there's the added problem of Holocaust survivors' testimony being, for many people, sacred. So dealing with it in a way that raises questions of accuracy can itself seem wrong. Maybe I should show you the YouTube, because it is our first attempt to answer that exact question. And the answer, our first thought, is we're not going to map it in the conventional way. And this isn't just because it would be difficult or perhaps wrong in some ways. By listening to testimony over the last year and a half or so, we're discovering that the most important stories for many survivors are not about abstract places or distances. The big stories happen in small places. They happen in a room or a field or a train car or a passing encounter with someone who either threatens them or does them bodily harm or saves them. So what we're thinking now is that relational space is much more important than geographical space, at least in the first instance. Ultimately, in the long run, I want to bring those together, the Nazi precision of space and the panoptic view with victims' experiences. But let me show you. My latest research assistant, Levi Westerveld, did a very experimental video that he's put up on YouTube, and I can give you the link if you wish, of condensing 45 minutes of one man's testimony into just a couple of minutes.
Not this form. But it was kosher the house. My father went to the services every morning. It was the crash in America, and everybody knows when there's a cold in America, the whole world is sneezing. And we sneezed in the same way in my hometown. There wasn't enough to live. But I used to go to public school. I was in the third and the fourth grade, that we went without breakfast. There was no food in the house. One time I came home, my mother was crying, and she didn't have anything for the children on the table. And if anybody who knows the history, when the Germans took some of lands which were adjoining them, including Polish land too, they lived close to a big country like Germany was, and Poland was a small, weak country. My father had his whole family left Poland in the 30s. They went to Paris. I decided to leave town. We came over, we were on the border. It was pretty hard to cross the border. We went in, we lived in all four of us went and we lived in the Soviet Union on the occupied territories, they called them. We were in Ravaruska, we were in Lembert, the synagogues were packed. I slept in a synagogue, so there were hundreds of people there on the floor, all over. And the lice were crawling. So I got tired of it, and I decided to go back to Ravaruska. And on the way, the Russian caught us, and they wanted to send us out to Siberia. One of my friends decided we're not going to go. We jumped the trucks, and we decided to go back home.
Now, I said this was highly experimental. I would never publish a Holocaust victim's experience in circles. But what this did was, for a moment, free us from the map, which demands precision, and got us thinking about What areas is he aware of? Which places matter to him? Where does he go repeatedly? And this sort of, it's a kind of graphic ideation, conceptual sketching, is helping us think about what may eventually become layers of visualization, perhaps the precise ground of what's happening in Europe or in Poland or in Aberystwyth goes faint. You get layers of transparency or a sort of visual fog, and someone's precise experience comes in as text or voice or a rendering of a place. Ultimately, this may require cinematic treatment. I don't know, filming on site that would then come into view and would fade away again. But ultimately, what I'd like to try to do is situate victims' experiences within the context of what's happening around them, of which they were usually unaware until it hit them. Does that make sense? So representation is now our biggest challenge. Huge challenge. And maybe we won't succeed at all. I don't know. Yes?
I'm wondering about the logic of the study. I think it's fascinating. But this study is sort of taken from an entirely different point of view
Yes.
than most studies. Most studies start out with a question,
Mhm.
develop a method, and
Mhm.
you get an answer.
Mhm.
Here you seem to have started out with a method.
Hmm.
And what are you searching for? A
Ah,
question?
yeah, excellent.
Are you searching for an answer which will lead to a question? What's your train of thought on that?
Our question for the testimony work is, can we find, identify, extract, and represent the spatial experience of Holocaust victims? That's our research question. We think that testimony is the most promising source because it is rich with spatial references. Another way to put this is, instead of looking at the geography of Holocaust from the perpetrator's point of view, can we look at geographical experience from the victim's point of view? And how can we represent that? Should it be pictorial? Should it be cartographic? Should it be abstract? Should it be voice or cinema and so forth? So we are simultaneously trying to answer the research question of what was spatial experience in the Holocaust and find methods to answer the question. So it's an iterative process, a question in search of method and methods that begin shaping the question. It's part of, I think that's fairly common in digital work. It's part of what makes it very uncomfortable for some people, because it is not like the work that I did in the Mastering Iron, for example. The question was, why was the United States so far behind the British in manufacturing large amounts of iron cheaply in the 19th century? And I went about systematically trying to answer that, doing all kinds of archival research and so forth. I also built a GIS database that was very useful. This project is more exploratory and uncertain because nothing like this has ever been done before. So we are navigating very uncertain territory. So it's an excellent question and a very fair one. Yes?
So you just said that this wasn't like the purpose of your research, which is fine, but I was just wondering, do you think this could help us like understand why the Allies didn't bomb Auschwitz and the
Phew.
lines?
I think I would defer to the political scientists who have written a little bit about that, the sort of geopolitics of the war. I don't know this field at all well, but my understanding is that the US and the British High Command, who were flying that territory on occasion, had more important objectives from their point of view. And that there were also some, at least in the President Roosevelt's administration, who said we shouldn't be bombing people. But I don't know that our work could help answer that question. I'll think about it. I don't think so, though. Yes, ma'am.
So it seems as though your research area was in a completely different field. And
Yes.
you encountered this project. So how was it for you to suddenly be exposed to this wealth of information about an historical topic that maybe you weren't so familiar with? Did it impede you, or did it actually help the project?
I was terrified. I was uncertain. I felt a charlatan for 5.5 years. And the the event that changed my mind was when Tim Cole, the Budapest expert, and I were asked to run a faculty seminar. It actually helped inspire a Art History Institute at Middlebury that Pamela took part in 2014. The faculty seminar was to invite scholars from any discipline who studied the Holocaust to come to the Holocaust Museum for 10 days to work with us to learn how to think about the Holocaust geographically, which was new for all of them. And those faculty and graduate students were so excited. They learned so much. They came up with so many ideas for the classroom, for mapping the Holocaust to make it more real for their students, to get them thinking about change over time and the movement of armies in relation to arrests and deportations, that they said, this is a fabulous way to teach the Holocaust. And I thought, well, that at least tells me that we're doing something valuable here for part of Holocaust studies. How much influence the research is going to have on scholarship remains completely to be seen, but there is another little indication that we're having some influence because the theme of next fall's biannual Holocaust conference, the biggest international conference on the Holocaust, is Holocaust Studies Enters the Digital Age. And we've been told that our work has been fundamental to convincing the conference organizers that Holocaust historians need to think about this, begin to confront all the challenges in digital history. But it was absolutely terrifying. And I remain very uncertain and am learning constantly. Every time I teach a Holocaust course, I learn more. But our colleagues on the historical side felt the same way about geography and mapping. So my opening comments maybe now make a little bit more sense. That Paul Jascott is the world's expert on the built environment of Holocaust. He has learned GIS and is now thinking in new ways. I've learned enough about Auschwitz and other aspects of the Holocaust to decide to commit my scholarly career to this. So it's not for the faint-hearted, though.
I was about to say that's a wonderful note to conclude on, but the warning about the faint-hearted. But with that, can we thank Professor Knowles for an excellent...
Thank you.